The sweltering heat of a Texas afternoon blanketed the quiet, sun-drenched streets of a modest rural neighborhood nestled near the border with Mexico. It was the kind of place where time moved slowly, and neighbors still knew each other's names. On this particular day in 2011, Evie Marlowe stood in the manicured backyard of the Rodriguez family, a soft breeze fluttering the edge of her wide-brimmed sun hat as she observed the celebration unfolding before her. She had been invited, along with her husband Walter, to a birthday party for young Tommy Rodriguez. Children ran in chaotic loops through the yard, their squeals of laughter mixing with the low hum of adult conversation. Multicolored balloons swayed gently above tables stacked with snacks and slices of cake. Though Evie was now 60, her poise and gentle features betrayed the emotional weight she carried. Her eyes, dulled slightly by decades of grief, still scanned every gathering with the subtle urgency of a mother forever searching for faces that were no longer there. Walter, just 2 years her senior, chatted nearby with a group of neighbors around the grill, smoke rising in lazy spirals into the sky. The couple had arrived an hour earlier, greeted warmly as familiar faces in a tight-knit community. After the singing of the birthday song, blowing out of candles, and sharing of cake, the event had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Evie stood near the patio, half listening to Martha from 2 houses down recount her battle with invasive weeds in her flower beds. Then something changed. The sliding glass door creaked open behind her. From the corner of her eye, Evie noticed a man she didn't recognize stepping out onto the patio. He held the hand of a young boy, no older than 8. "Sorry we're late," the man said with a smile directed at no one in particular. "Something came up at home." Before anyone could respond, the boy tugged free from his father's grasp and bolted into the yard, eager to join the other children in their games. But as he passed by Evie, her breath caught in her throat. The boy's outfit, a pair of green checkered overalls with bright yellow straps over a long-sleeved shirt, sent a jolt through her chest. His dark curls bounced with each stride. A sense of deep, disorienting familiarity gripped her. Without a word, Evie crossed the yard, her footsteps quick and unsteady, her heart racing. She reached out and gently turned the boy to face her. "Where did you get those clothes?" she asked, her voice trembling, barely above a whisper. Her hand hovered near his hair, almost involuntarily drawn to the texture and curl that mirrored memories etched in her mind. Startled, the boy jerked away, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Daddy!" he cried, running back to the man on the patio. "She touched me. She scared me." The father's concern was immediate. He walked quickly to his son, wrapping a protective arm around the boy's shoulders, his eyes fixed on Evie, filled with cautious alarm. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his tone firm but not aggressive. "Why did you grab my son?" Evie's lips moved, but words failed her. Her gaze remained locked on the boy's overalls. Her hand reached out again, stopping just short of touching the fabric. "His clothes, those overalls, where did you buy them?" The man frowned, confused and now visibly defensive. "Excuse me, what's going on?" Walter appeared at her side just then, followed by a few concerned partygoers. He placed a steadying arm around Evie, noting her pale complexion and wide-eyed stare. "I'm very sorry," he said, addressing the man. "My wife didn't mean any harm." Walter's voice was steady, but Evie felt his body tense beside her. "Your son's outfit," he continued. "It looks exactly like the ones our boys wore." "Our boys," he added with quiet gravity, "were triplets. They disappeared 30 years ago, back in 1981. They were wearing green checkered overalls with yellow straps and long-sleeved shirts." Just like that. Murmurs spread through the gathering. Mrs. Rodriguez, the hostess, stepped forward, her voice gentle. "It's true," she said to the stranger. "The Marlowe boys vanished from this very neighborhood. It was a heartbreaking time. Everyone joined the search. The man's posture shifted instantly. "Oh my God," he said, his tone filled with sympathy. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea. We're new in town. I just thought this party would be a good way to meet people." He looked down at his son's clothes. "I bought them at a department store a while ago. I don't even remember where." Evie took a tentative step forward, eyes pleading. "Please, I just need to look, just to see if it's the same brand." Walter gently but firmly pulled her back. "Evie, sweetheart, that boy isn't Lucas, or Noah, or Gabrielle. Let's not scare him more than we already have." He turned to the father. "I'm truly sorry for all this. It's been hard." Mrs. Rodriguez touched Evie's arm with a look of concern. "Evie, honey, you're as pale as a sheet. You should go home and rest." Walter nodded in agreement. "Yes, let's go, love." He thanked the hosts, offered a respectful apology to the man and his son, and began to guide Evie back toward the street. "I really am sorry," the man called after them. "I didn't mean to upset anyone." "It's not your fault," Walter replied over his shoulder. They walked the 3 blocks to their house in silence, Walter's arm firmly around his wife's shoulders. Inside, he settled her onto the living room sofa and went to the kitchen to prepare tea. When he returned, he handed her the warm cup and watched as she took a sip with trembling hands. "I didn't mean to frighten that little boy," Evie said, her voice cracking. Tears brimmed in her eyes. "But those clothes, it was like seeing a ghost." Walter sat beside her, pulling her close. "I know," he said softly. "You had a panic attack. It's okay." "I can't stop thinking about them," she whispered, tears now flowing freely, "even after all these years." Walter squeezed her hand. "They'd be grown now," he murmured, "men in their 30s. "I know," she said, "and I still bring them up. I know I make people uncomfortable." "Don't apologize," he said gently. "They were our sons. You never forget your children." Outside, the sun had dipped lower, casting elongated shadows over their porch as the heat finally began to wane. Inside their home, everything remained just as it had for decades. Pictures on the mantel that hadn't changed, old toys tucked away in storage boxes, the boys' room untouched except for the dust collected through the years. Walter had once suggested turning it into a study, but Evie couldn't bring herself to alter a single thing. The beds remained made. The walls still bore crayon doodles from another lifetime. That moment at the party had triggered something deeply buried in her, a mother's instinct that time could never dull. "It's the way he ran," she murmured after a long silence. "Even the way his hair moved. It was too familiar." Walter listened, patient as ever. He had walked beside her through every step of this painful journey, never pushing, never silencing her grief. "Sometimes memories play tricks on us," he said gently, though his voice wavered. "Our minds try to comfort us. It's how we survive." "But what if it wasn't just memory?" she asked, her gaze distant. "What if there's more? What if we missed something all those years ago?" Walter took a deep breath, thinking of the countless leads that went nowhere, the flyers, the detectives, the dead ends. "If there's even a sliver of doubt," he said finally, "we'll follow it. You know I'd do anything." Evie nodded, a fresh determination surfacing through the sorrow. "Then tomorrow," she said, "I want to look through the boxes in the attic, the photographs, the clothes. Maybe there's something we overlooked." Outside, the cicadas had begun their evening song, and inside the Marlowe house, for the first time in years, a dormant hope stirred once more. "We don't have to erase them from our memories," Walter said with quiet conviction, his voice anchored in the kind of sorrow only long years of silence can breed. "I'll admit it, I felt it too. When I saw that boy's outfit, it stunned me. The colors, the pattern, green checkered overalls with those yellow straps, the long sleeves, it looked just like what our boys used to wear. Evie straightened up on the couch, her back stiff from tension, her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. I want to see their photographs again, Walter. The ones where they're wearing those outfits. Walter hesitated. A shadow flickered across his face. They're upstairs, he said, his voice almost reluctant. In the attic. We haven't touched that box in over 20 years. Please, she said softly. If it helps quiet my mind, I need to see them again. He gave a weary sigh, but nodded. All right, I'll get it. As Walter disappeared up the staircase, the sound of his footsteps creaked through the quiet house. Evie listened intently, the distant shuffle of his movements followed by the groan of the attic ladder unfolding. Dust stirred in her memory even before he returned. Moments later he descended carefully, carrying a large cardboard box covered in the soft patina of time, faded brittle tape still holding its corners together, and a layer of dust thick enough to write in. Evie lit a handful of cigarettes, thick enough to write in. He set it gently on the coffee table and wiped away the grime with an old dish towel. They opened it together, almost reverently, as if unveiling a sacred relic. Inside were the preserved fragments of 3 childhoods that had never reached adolescence. The first layer held toys, small, hand-sized plastic animals, wooden blocks, and a few beat-up action figures. Beneath them, baseball gloves, still shaped to the curve of tiny hands. Next, 3 identical teddy bears, their fur matted from love. Then old drawings, fading construction paper cards labeled to Mom and Dad, spelling still clumsy but heartfelt. Evie held up one of the bears, pressing it gently to her chest, as if the gesture might bridge the years between then and now. Walter reached for a stack of crayon sketches, stick figures of their family, their house, a dog they'd never owned but always wanted. Each item was an echo, a suspended fragment of the life they once knew. The photo album should be at the bottom, Walter murmured, his throat tightening. We packed it last. I remember because it was the hardest thing to put away. They dug deeper, slowly removing the final layers until a leather-bound album emerged. Walter lifted it from the box like a fragile treasure and set it across his lap. The brown leather cover was worn smooth at the edges, the corners slightly frayed. Though untouched in decades, it felt familiar in his hands. They sat side by side on the couch, knees touching, shoulders brushing. He opened the album, and they were instantly met by the first image. 3 swaddled newborns in matching hospital bassinets. Walter turned the pages with deliberate care. First steps captured in blurry motion, birthday parties with candles being extinguished in perfect unison. Halloween costumes arranged with meticulous parental pride. They were always so connected, Evie whispered, her fingers brushing across a photo of the boys kneeling at the beach, building a sandcastle together. They never needed to speak. They just knew. Walter nodded, silent. Page after page brought back waves of memory, each one powerful, bittersweet, piercing. Then they found it. The photo they had both been seeking. The triplets stood in front of the house on a bright morning, arms around one another, grinning with innocent joy. Each wore their signature outfit, green checkered overalls with yellow straps over long-sleeved white shirts. This was the last photo, Walter said, his voice barely audible, taken just an hour before they disappeared. Evie leaned in closer, squinting at the photo. Look here, she said, tapping the image. The boy at the party today? His outfit was similar, yes, but now I see it's not the same. The green is brighter in this photo, more muted, more vintage, and the checkered lines are wider. Walter studied it. You're right. The straps, too. They were stitched differently. Same general style, but not the same garment. I overreacted, Evie admitted, wiping at her eyes. I feel awful. That poor child. And his father. What were their names again? Malvin is the boy, Walter replied, and the father's name is Rowan. They moved into the neighborhood maybe 3 months ago. I should apologize, she said softly. I must have scared that little boy. They continued staring at the photo, letting it carry them back to the last day they were a family of 5. Evie smiled through her tears. Remember how Gabriel insisted on wearing his overalls backward that morning? Walter chuckled, and Noah already had a grass stain on his knee before breakfast. As he poured himself another cup of tea, Evie suddenly reached out, touching his arm with urgency. The motion caused a small spill across the saucer. Walter, look at the background, she said, pointing at the photo. Isn't that the Cadillac? The reddish-brown one Lucas was obsessed with? He squinted at the edge of the frame. Sure enough, partially visible in the background was the unmistakable curved front of a vintage Cadillac, parked along the curb. You're right, he said slowly. Lucas adored that car. He used to beg me to take him to see it. That's Mr. Howard Fielding's Cadillac, Evie said, her voice quickening. You remember him? Their old school teacher? Ivo Leet. Walter nodded, his brow furrowing. Of course. He barely drove it, said it was his pride and joy. Everyone at school knew about it. The kids worshipped that car, Evie whispered. And Howard, too. He was kind, so patient with the boys. She turned the photo over, checking for notes, then back again, examining every detail. Walter, are you certain this photo was taken on the day they vanished? I am, he said. It was taken that morning. I remember distinctly. They disappeared in the afternoon. But that doesn't add up, Evie replied, her voice trembling. Howard had moved out of town a week before they went missing. Don't you remember? All the parents were upset. We had a going-away party for him at the school. Walter's eyes narrowed. That can't be right. This was taken that day, wasn't it? He turned back to the box, rummaging through the items until he located a yellow Kodak photo envelope, the kind that once held printed pictures and negatives. He pulled it out, flipping it over to reveal a date stamped in ink. Here, he said, holding it out. The film was processed 2 days after they disappeared. Evie took it, her hands trembling. So, the picture really was taken that morning. Walter nodded slowly. If Howard's car was still here, that means he hadn't left town yet. Or he came back. Well, would he come back? She asked, goosebumps prickling her arms despite the warm summer air. And if he did, why didn't anyone mention seeing him? Walter stared into the distance, thoughts unraveling. If that really was his car, he could have witnessed something, maybe something critical. Evie's voice was quiet, barely a whisper. The police, they would have questioned him, wouldn't they? They both sat in silence as the weight of the revelation settled heavily in the room, the photo album still open across Walter's lap. A single, undeniable truth pulsed in the air. Someone might have overlooked something vital all those years ago. Evie paused, her mind racing. But if the police never mentioned interviewing Mr. Howard, then maybe he really was already gone by the time the boys disappeared. Walter, seeing the strain returning to her features, reached over and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Evie, love, try not to spiral. It could be nothing, just a coincidence. That car in the photo might not even be Mr. Howard's Cadillac. We can't be certain. But who else around here had a Cadillac? She countered, her voice sharpening, especially one like that. You remember how close knit this neighborhood was. We knew every car that drove down our street. Walter took a deep breath, speaking gently, trying to anchor her back to reason. It might have belonged to a visitor, Someone dropping by to see a neighbor. It doesn't mean it was Howard's. Evie frowned, the gears in her mind turning. Maybe, but I still think it's strange. That car was iconic, and if it was parked outside the house that morning, someone must have seen it. Walter gave a small nod. It's okay to wonder. But don't forget, the police looked through all our photo albums back then, including that one. They would have noticed something that stood out, like a distinctive car. If it had been relevant, they would have tracked it down, checked license plates, followed up with us. Evie closed her eyes and accepted another sip of tea from the cup he offered her. The warmth calmed her hands, which had begun to tremble. She took a long breath. "You're right," she murmured. "I'm probably overthinking it. Maybe it's just my mind trying to make sense of what it never could." Walter smiled softly, grateful to see the tension ease from her brow. He closed the photo album with care and watched as Evie gently set aside the picture, keeping it close on the coffee table. Together they began repacking the box, each memento treated with the same reverence as before. Bit by bit, they returned the pieces of the past to their safe, dusty resting place. After the final item was tucked inside, Walter stood and glanced at the ornate brass clock on the mantel. He blanched. "Good Lord," he exclaimed. "It's already 11:30. I completely lost track of time. I've got that checkup with Dr. Matthews at 11:50. Evie blinked in surprise. "That's right. And it's Saturday. The clinic closes early, only open until 1. They moved in unison, years of routine guiding them. Evie helped Walter gather everything he needed for his appointment: his health insurance card, his medication list, and the worn leather journal where he'd faithfully recorded weeks of blood pressure readings. Within 5 minutes, Walter stood by the front door, dressed, ready, and clutching his satchel. "Are you sure you'll be okay while I'm gone?" "I'll be fine," Evie said with a reassuring smile. "I'll fix some lunch, maybe take a nap. Don't worry, I'll have dinner ready by the time you're back." Walter kissed her gently on the cheek. "Call me if you need anything." "I will," she promised. Moments later, the sound of the car engine faded down the street. Alone now, Evie wandered into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. She reached for her phone, noticing a text she hadn't seen earlier. From Louise Mitchell, an old friend and former administrator with the local school board. The message read, "Annual school district retiree reunion is coming up next month. Hope you and Walter can attend. We miss you both." Evie stared at the screen. Louise had worked for the district for over 30 years and had retired just before the turn of the century. She would have known all about Mr. Howard Fielding. His employment, his departure, maybe even more. Driven by impulse, she tapped Louise's contact and pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before the familiar warm voice answered. "Evie, what a lovely surprise. I was just thinking about you. Did you see my message about the reunion?" "I did," Evie replied. "Walter and I will try to make it. It's been too long." They spent a few minutes exchanging pleasantries, updates on old colleagues, family news, small-town gossip, but eventually Evie steered the conversation to the real reason for her call. "Louise, do you remember Mr. Howard Fielding? He taught at Oak Ridge Elementary in the early 80s. "Howard?" Louise laughed fondly. "Of course I remember him. Such a brilliant teacher. He had a way with children. Do you happen to know where he ended up? I remember him saying he was moving to another town to continue teaching." There was a pause on the line. "You know?" "I think you might be misremembering," Louise said slowly. "Howard never filed any transfer paperwork after he left Oak Ridge. At least, not within the public school system." Evie sat upright, startled. "He didn't? But we had a farewell party for him. He told everyone he was moving to teach somewhere else." "I remember that too," Louise admitted. "But I think he might have been joking, or perhaps avoiding giving the real reason. From what I heard, he moved out to a rural area, somewhere quite remote, and started a private program. A charity farm for immigrant children, if I'm not mistaken. A farm? Evie echoed, confused. That's not what I ever imagined. I was so sure he just transferred schools. No, nothing like that, Louise said. Someone mentioned the name of the place to me a few months ago. Let me think. Evie waited, heart beating faster. I've got it. Howard's Haven for Hope. Evie repeated the name under her breath, committing it to memory. Howard's Haven for Hope. Louise's tone turned curious. Why do you ask about Howard all of a sudden? Evie hesitated. I came across an old family photo today. I saw a car in the background that looked exactly like Howard's Cadillac. You remember the one? Oh, yes, Louise confirmed. That car was gorgeous, reddish-brown, but he barely drove it, kept it mostly in the garage, treated it like a collectible. Do you remember when exactly he left town? Evie asked, her pulse quickening. Louise sighed. It's been so long, dear, I really couldn't say for certain. Sometime in the summer of '81, I think. After hanging up, Evie walked directly to the small home office. Her fingers trembled as she sat at the computer and opened the browser. She typed Howard's Haven for Hope, Texas, and hit enter. Search results began to populate the screen. Various pages mentioning charitable outreach, youth programs, and a nonprofit based in a rural corner of Texas. A faded photo of a wooden sign appeared in the sidebar. Howard's Haven for Hope, St. 1982. Evie's breath caught. It was real. She clicked through to the organization's homepage. The website was simple, almost outdated, but still functional. It listed their mission: providing shelter, education, and life skills to undocumented and at-risk children. There were photographs of barns, vegetable gardens, children helping with chores, and small dormitories. A few staff bios were posted as well, but no photo of Howard. Scrolling down, she found a brief history of the organization. Founded by a retired educator named Howard F., who wished to remain largely anonymous, the site noted. It was odd, Edie thought, that someone so well loved in their community would suddenly prefer to be unseen. She clicked on the Contact Us page. A mailing address was listed, along with a phone number. No email, no social media links. It was as if the place had been deliberately kept off-grid. She stared at the phone number for several long seconds. Her fingers hovered over the keypad of the cordless phone beside the computer. But she didn't dial. Not yet. Instead, she reached into the drawer and pulled out a notepad. She scribbled down the address, the phone number, and the name of the organization. She knew Walter wouldn't be thrilled about digging this deep again, but something inside her told her not to ignore it. There had always been small loose ends in the story, minor inconsistencies that went unquestioned in the chaos and devastation of losing 3 children. But now, with this photo, with this car, and with Howard's odd disappearance from the educational system, those fragments began to feel like they might connect. She set the pad down and leaned back in her chair, heart thudding. Something wasn't right, and this time, she wasn't going to dismiss it. She found the website quickly. It was plain, minimally designed, offering just the essentials. The homepage banner displayed smiling young men and boys working under the Texas sun on tidy rows of farmland. Most of them appeared to be of Hispanic or Mexican descent, their dark hair tousled, their faces glowing with youth and sweat. There was nothing overtly suspicious. On the contrary, the imagery conveyed a wholesome, hopeful atmosphere. Evie clicked through the gallery, flipping past pictures of classrooms and converted barns, vegetable gardens full of children picking produce, and group photos of staff and volunteers posing together. It all seemed authentic, compassionate, the kind of operation born out of someone's deep-seated desire to make a difference. On the About page, she found a brief biography of Howard Fielding. It described his former role as an elementary school teacher, his dedication to youth education, and how he had transitioned into charitable work. The mission of the farm was clearly stated: to provide safe shelter, education, and life skills to immigrant youth, especially those facing legal or financial hardship. She jotted down the farm's address and noticed an email contact, but no phone number was listed. That struck her as odd. For a functioning organization, she expected more avenues of contact. She stared at the screen, debating her next move. Maybe she was overreacting, maybe the Cadillac had been a red herring, but something about seeing it in the photo again, the same curves, the same hue, parked right outside their house on the day her boys disappeared, left a nagging unease. She checked the time, 11:45 a.m. If she left now, she could reach the farm by early afternoon. It was a 90-minute drive. Plenty of daylight left. Without another thought, she grabbed her phone and dialed Walter at the clinic. "Walter, how's your appointment going?" she asked when he picked up. "I'm still in the waiting room," he said. "Everything okay?" "Yes, but I found some more information about Howard," she explained. "Louise told me about his farm. I want to go there today." There was a pause. "I don't know, Evie. I'm a little worried. You're fixated on this Cadillac thing." "I'm fine," she said firmly. "This isn't about paranoia. I just think it would be good to see him, catch up, maybe even show him the photo and ask about the car." Walter sighed. "All right, but we should call him first, let him know we're coming." "Didn't see a phone number, just an email." "I'll send a message, but he might not see it in time." They agreed to meet at the clinic. Walter would finish his appointment, and Evie would take the bus to meet him there. "I'm leaving now," she said, already reaching for her purse. "See you soon." She locked the front door behind her, walking quickly down the quiet sidewalk toward the bus stop 3 blocks away. The Texas heat was growing, pressing against her skin, but she didn't care. Just as she reached the stop, the bus arrived with a hiss of brakes and the opening of the doors. 15 minutes later, she stepped off in front of the clinic. As she did, a cheerful woman in a straw hat handed her a bright flyer. "County Agricultural Fair this week," the woman chirped before turning to hand another flyer to a departing passenger. Evie glanced at the paper as she approached the clinic. It advertised a full week of agricultural activities: petting zoos, food vendors, farming competitions. Today's event included a special equipment auction held near the rural community where Howard's farm was located. She murmured, "Interesting," and tucked the flyer into her purse. Inside the clinic, Walter was just settling his co-payment at the cashier's desk. "Perfect timing," he said, greeting her with a smile. "Dr. Matthews says everything looks good. My blood pressure's down since the meds were adjusted." "That's great news," she replied with genuine relief. "Are you ready for our little adventure?" Soon they were on the road, Walter's sedan humming beneath them. The GPS guided them away from suburban streets and into broad countryside, the scenery shifting to silos, wheat fields, and long stretches of open land. "Any reply to your email?" Walter asked, eyes on the road. "Not yet," she said, pulling the flyer from her purse. "But look at this. I got it at the bus stop. Today there's an auction, and it's being held not far from Howard's farm." Walter glanced at it briefly. "You think he'll be there?" "It's possible. The auction's practically next door. Maybe we'll find him there if he's not at the farm." "Let's visit the farm first," Walter suggested. "If he's not there, we'll check out the auction afterward." They continued driving for another hour, roads narrowing and growing dustier as they ventured deeper into rural Texas. Eventually, they turned down a gravel path marked by a weathered wooden sign, "Howard's Haven for Hope." The driveway led past tall grass, open pastures, and a line of modest buildings: barns, a farmhouse, and what looked like dormitories for the children. The place was calm, almost too quiet. As they stepped out of the car, a young man in work clothes emerged from one of the barns. "Hello there," Walter called, raising a hand. The young man approached with a polite smile. "Can I help you folks?" "We're looking for Howard Fielding," Evie said. "Is this his place?" "Yes, this is Mr. Fielding's farm," he confirmed. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, not exactly," Walter said. "We're old friends of his, from before he started the farm. We sent an email, but didn't get a reply." "Oh," the young man said, nodding in understanding. "We've been switching to a new email address this month. The website hasn't been updated yet. That's probably why you haven't heard back." He hesitated. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Fielding isn't here right now." "Do you know when he'll return?" Evie asked. "Usually in the evening, but today he's helping with the auction over at the county fair. It's only 10 minutes away. Just follow the main road east to County Route 12. You'll see the signs." "Thank you," Walter said. "We appreciate it." "You're welcome," the young man replied. "He'll be happy to see old friends." As they got back into the car, Evie clutched her purse tightly. She could feel it, the moment coming closer. A reunion decades overdue, and maybe, just maybe, a piece of the truth waiting at the end of the next road. "Heath and most of our staff and children went to the county agricultural event," the young man explained, his voice friendly and patient. "There's an auction today, and we're also running a stall to promote our charity program." "Yes, we just heard about the event," Evie said, masking her disappointment with a polite smile. She turned back toward the car, ready to leave, but Walter gently touched her arm. "Wait," he said, looking at the young man. "Since we're already here, would it be possible to look around the farm a bit? We'd love to see what Howard has built." The young man hesitated. "Let me check with the supervisor on duty. One moment, please." He stepped aside and made a quick phone call. After a brief exchange, he returned with a smile. "That's fine. I'd be happy to show you around." For the next 30 minutes, Walter and Edie followed him across the property. He guided them past stables, with horses calmly swaying their tails, livestock pens, and wide fields dotted with rows of vegetables. As they walked, he described the farm's mission in more detail, how they worked to support undocumented and at-risk children by teaching them agricultural skills, offering classes, and providing housing and mentorship. "This is one of our special barns," he said as they approached a brightly painted structure adorned with cheerful murals and children's artwork. "It's designed for our youngest children to explore, play, and get messy while learning." Mr. Fielding started this part of the program to introduce the farm lifestyle to kids in a fun, engaging way. Inside the barn, they found a man arranging craft materials on low tables. He appeared to be in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, with thick black curly hair and pale skin. He smiled warmly as they entered. "Ferdinand, these are friends of Mr. Fielding," their guide said. "They stopped by hoping to see him." Ferdinand wiped his hands on a towel and stepped forward. "I'm Ferdinand, the activities coordinator. Nice to meet you." "Walter and Evie Marlowe," Walter said, shaking his hand. Ferdinand gestured to the tables. "I'm setting up for some demonstration activities. We have a few prospective donors visiting this week, so we're showing how we work with the kids. I've been here most of my life, actually. Mr. Howard took me in when I was 6 years old, gave me a home when I didn't have one." Evie nodded, her eyes locked on him. "Howard was a school teacher before he started this, you know. Our sons were his students. He always had a gift with children. He's got a noble heart," Ferdinand said. "Saved a lot of us." They walked around the barn, admiring the children's artwork covering one entire wall. Crayon drawings shared space with creative collages made from leaves, oats, and rice. One drawing stood out, a red Cadillac meticulously decorated with colorful grains of rice and outlined with precise detail. "That car," Evie said softly, pointing to it. "That's Mr. Howard's, isn't it? He treasured that vehicle." Ferdinand nodded. "He sure did. He still owns it. Took it out this morning, in fact." He smiled with pride. "That drawing is mine, actually. I made it as a sample for the kids to follow. That's why it's a bit neater than theirs." Evie's heart skipped. A strange sensation coursed through her, a rush of cold, like a breeze against her skin. She studied Ferdinand more closely. His smile, the way he used his hands when he spoke, his posture. There was something achingly familiar. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Ferdinand asked, sensing her focus. Walter gently placed his hand on Evie's back, a silent cue. "Yes, yes," Evie said quickly, forcing a smile. "Sorry, the crafts just reminded me of our boys." She hesitated, then added, "Do you have any siblings?" "Evie," Walter warned under his breath. Ferdinand chuckled. "Yeah, actually. My brother's at the event today with Mr. Howard. He helps with the auction." As they prepared to leave, they thanked Ferdinand for his time, and their guide led them back toward the car. Evie glanced back over her shoulder once more, a flood of questions and impressions colliding in her mind. Once seated in the car, her hands trembled as she buckled in. Walter checked the GPS. "The auction site is only 20 minutes from here," he said. "Should we go?" "Absolutely," she replied, her voice low but urgent. "I need to speak with Mr. Howard." As they drove, Walter glanced at her. "Why did you ask Ferdinand if he had siblings?" Evie stared out the window. "I don't know. I had this strange feeling when I saw that drawing of the Cadillac he made. And then his hair, his smile. Something about him feels familiar. I don't know what it was," she continued slowly. "Something about the way he spoke, how he moved around the room. It reminded me of someone." "Someone like?" Walter pressed gently, eyes still focused on the road. "Lucas," she whispered. "Or maybe Noah. There's something about Ferdinand. It's not just his smile or his hair. It's a feeling. Like I've seen him before. Like part of me recognizes him, deep down." Walter was silent for a moment. "That's a heavy thought," he said at last. "You really think he could be—" "I don't know what to think yet," Evie interrupted, her voice tight with emotion. "But what if one of our boys was taken in by Howard and raised under a different identity? What if he never knew who he really was?" Walter exhaled slowly. "That would mean Howard knew something. That he was involved." They rode in silence as the countryside blurred by. The GPS directed them toward the auction site, nestled on a wide expanse of farmland bordered by white fences and dusty access roads. Cars lined up near a large red barn where tents, tables, and loudspeakers had been set up. As they pulled into the lot and parked, Evie spotted a familiar reddish-brown Cadillac gleaming under the sun, parked in a place of honor near the auction stage. Her heart leapt. "That's it," she said, pointing. Walter nodded grimly, no mistaking it. They approached the main tent, the hum of chatter and the rhythmic drone of the auctioneer filling the air. Walter asked around until one of the event organizers directed them to a seating area behind the tent, where some of the fair's key contributors were gathered. And there, seated under a shaded canopy, was Howard Fielding. He stood as they approached, his face lighting up with recognition. "You made it," he said warmly. "Yes," Evie said, her voice steady but cool. "We wanted to see you in person." Howard gestured for them to sit. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Evie pulled the photo from her purse again and handed it to him. "This, and Ferdinand." Howard studied the photo for a long moment, then looked up. "You're thinking he might be one of your sons?" "I don't know what I'm thinking," Evie admitted. "But he said you took him in at 6. That would have been close to the time our boys went missing." Howard rubbed his jaw, visibly troubled. "Ferdinand was brought to me by someone I trusted. Said he'd been abandoned. I didn't ask too many questions. Maybe I should have. Evie's heart pounded. Do you have any records? Anything that might tell you where he came from? I keep everything, Howard said quietly, back at the farm. You're welcome to look. She turned to face Walter. They look like Lucas, she said quietly, almost as if afraid to believe it herself. Walter shook his head gently. Evie, you can't possibly think that. They look very different. Just because of the hair color, the curls, the smile. It doesn't mean... I know, she cut in. I know. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be inappropriate, it's just... something about him felt familiar. Walter patted her hand, offering silent reassurance. He didn't argue further. The rest of the short drive to the county fairgrounds passed in thoughtful silence. They arrived to find the fair in full swing. Bright tents and colorful booths encircled a large open field where tractors and equipment stood proudly on display. Children ran between stalls holding cotton candy. Parents chatted over rows of canned goods and prize produce. To auction right now, Walter observed as he checked the posted schedule near the entrance. Looks like we missed it. See? They strolled through the fairgrounds, pausing to admire prize livestock, marvel at agricultural machinery, and take in the warm, lively atmosphere. About 10 minutes in, they spotted a white tent with a blue banner stretched across the top. Howard's Haven for Hope. As they neared it, Evie's breath caught. There, animatedly speaking with a well-dressed couple, was Howard Fielding. He was older now, his hair fully white, deep creases framing his eyes and mouth, but his gestures were unmistakably familiar. She watched him laugh, using his hands as he always had in the classroom to punctuate his words. They waited until the couple thanked him and moved on, then stepped forward. "Mr. Fielding," Walter said. Howard turned, polite but blank. "Yes? Can I help you?" "You probably don't remember us," Evie began. "I'm Evie Marlowe. This is my husband, Walter. Our sons, Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel. We're your students at Oak Ridge Elementary." Howard's brow furrowed. He studied their faces closely. "I'm terribly sorry. It's been so long, and I'm an old man now, nearly 70. He chuckled, tapping his temple. "The memory fades more every year, I'm afraid." Evie stepped closer. "I helped organize your farewell party, remember, with the other mothers. If there was ever a woman followed by 3 identical boys like ducklings, it was me. Evelyn Marlowe." Recognition bloomed slowly across Howard's face. A smile spread. "Of course. The Marlowe family. Lucas, Noah, and Gabrielle. Bright boys all 3. His smile dimmed slightly. "I was deeply saddened when I heard what happened. Such a terrible tragedy. We were surprised to learn about your farm," Walter said. "It's an impressive operation." "Thank you," Howard replied. "It's been my life's work for decades." Naturally, the conversation turned to the boys. Howard's face grew somber. "I always wondered what became of that investigation," he said. "I had already left town by then, but I remember hearing about it not long afterward." "I always thought you moved to another state to teach," Evie said carefully. Howard shook his head. "No, I stayed in Texas. Moved to a different town to get certified, then started planning this place. Starting the farm had always been my dream." Evie leaned forward slightly. "Do you remember the exact date you left town? Was it before or after the boys disappeared?" "Before," he said promptly. "It must have been before. Otherwise the police would have spoken with me." "I'm sure they would have." She didn't respond. Instead, she reached into her purse and handed him the photograph, the one taken the morning of the disappearance. "This was taken an hour before the boys vanished," she said. I noticed something. She pointed to the edge of the image. There's a car, a red Cadillac. Your car? Howard studied the photo. Walter stepped forward. Do you remember being in our neighborhood that day? He asked. Howard's expression shifted. The warm familiarity evaporated, replaced by a strained, unreadable tightness. I can't recall the exact date I left, he said, his voice low. And I certainly don't remember driving by your house. I didn't see the boys that day. He handed the photo back. It must belong to someone else. Walter nodded, placing a gentle hand on Evie's shoulder. Well, at least now we have our answer. Evie nodded too, but she noticed Walter's demeanor had changed. He looked tense, uncertain. Howard gave them a thin smile. Do you think the Cadillac is connected somehow? We're not sure, Walter replied. The police never mentioned it. We only noticed it this morning. Howard checked his watch. It's nearly 3:30. We'll be closing soon. He turned to his staff nearby. Let's start packing up. The event ends at 4. He turned back to them. If you haven't already, you should check out the children's performance. It's starting in a few minutes, just over there. He pointed to a small stage at the far end of the field. It's quite charming. You might enjoy it. Thank you, Walter said. It was good seeing you again. As they walked away, Evie hung back slightly. That's when she heard it. Howard's voice low and urgent. Leave immediately after the performance. Get Diego here. Yes, now. She froze, then slowly turned back. Howard was directing staff, his face impassive. No sign he'd noticed her lingering. But the tone, the words, they rang in her ears like a warning bell. Evie stood rooted in place for a moment longer, the words she'd just overheard echoing in her ears. Leave immediately after the performance. Get Diego here. The urgency in Howard's voice chilled her more than the words themselves. There was no mistaking it. His tone had shifted from warm reunion to something secretive and commanding. She turned slowly, trying to compose herself as she walked briskly to catch up with Walter, who had already made it halfway across the fairgrounds. He looked back, puzzled by her delay. What is it? He asked, noting the tension in her posture. Nothing, she said quietly. Let's go watch the children's performance. They joined the small crowd gathering at the outdoor stage. A line of children, all wearing matching T-shirts bearing the Howard's Haven for Hope logo, stood in rows. Some held instruments, others recited lines from a skit. Parents, staff, and visitors clapped and cheered at each segment. It was sweet, wholesome, a carefully staged celebration of the farm's mission. But Evie couldn't focus. Her eyes swept the area constantly, searching faces. Ferdinand wasn't there, nor was the young man he'd called his brother. She spotted a few of the staff she recognized from the earlier tour, but no sign of Howard. And who was Diego? Walter gently squeezed her hand, grounding her. What's going on? He whispered. I'm not sure yet, she murmured. But we need to leave as soon as this ends. I need to look into something. They stayed through the performance, clapping politely, then made their way quickly back to the car. As they drove away from the fairgrounds, Evie told Walter what she had heard. Muria Unayuska finished. Doin', he said to leave right after the performance. And to get Diego here. Like something was happening. Walter frowned deeply. That doesn't sound like someone reminiscing with old friends. No, Evie agreed. It sounds like someone covering tracks. Back at home that evening, Evie wasted no time. She sat at the computer, searching public records, non-profit databases, anything that might give her insight into the identity of Ferdinand or his supposed brother. She found a few listings for Howard's Haven for Hope in tax documents, some staff names, donation records, but no mention of Ferdinand by last name. No digital fingerprint. He existed in their website bios, but nothing more. It was as if he'd appeared out of nowhere. Walter entered the office with 2 cups of tea. "Find anything?" "Not yet," she said, "but I need to know who Ferdinand really is." Walter sat beside her, the warmth from his mug seeping into his palms. "If we want answers, we might have to go further than the internet." Evie nodded. "Tomorrow I'm going to call the local sheriff's office. Maybe they still have the original case file." Walter looked uneasy. "Are you ready for that?" "No," she admitted. "But I can't let this go." As the night deepened, the silence of their home was filled only by the hum of the computer and the unspoken questions that had returned to haunt them after all these years. She hurried to catch up with Walter, her mind swirling with questions and an encroaching sense of dread that settled heavy on her chest. They joined the gathering crowd near a small outdoor stage where a group of children had begun to line up for the final performance of the day. Most of the children appeared to be of Mexican heritage, ranging in age from about 6 to 9, with a few younger ones possibly still in kindergarten. The makeshift wooden platform was humble, planks atop cinder blocks, but the atmosphere was festive. The children began singing a bright Spanish folk tune, their young voices harmonizing with innocent energy. Evie stood still, clapping lightly, but her eyes weren't on the performers. She scanned the crowd, studying staff members, observing interactions, watching for anything that seemed off. Then something moved at the edge of the stage, someone emerging from behind the structure. A man walking briskly toward the vendor area. There was something urgent in his stride, almost as if he was trying not to run. Even from a distance, his thick black curls were unmistakable. "Walter," she whispered urgently, tugging at his sleeve. "Look at that man, the one heading toward the tents. See his hair? Doesn't he look like Ferdinand?" Walter followed her gaze, narrowing his eyes to focus on the rapidly retreating figure. "Yes," he said slowly. "The resemblance is striking." "Do you think they're twins?" Evie asked, her voice tight with an excitement so sharp it bordered on panic. But before Walter could respond, she was already weaving through the crowd, determined to catch a better glimpse of the man's face. Walter hurried after her, staying close as they maneuvered around families, concession stands, and farm equipment displays. They found cover near a cotton candy cart, positioning themselves discreetly behind a colorful tarp. From their vantage point, they could see the man had reached Howard's tent. He was now locked in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Howard Fielding himself. The man turned slightly, gesturing animatedly. Evie sucked in a breath. Oh my God. The resemblance to Ferdinand was uncanny. They could have been mirrors. The same wide, vibrant smile, the same arch to their brows, the same expressive hands flaring with every word spoken. "That must be the brother Ferdinand mentioned," she whispered. "Diego. I think that's who Howard was calling for." Walter's face had gone pale. Same curly hair. Same smile. Could they be Lucas and Noah? Evie finished for him, her voice almost too soft to hear. "And remember how Gabriel was always a little smaller, with slightly narrower eyes? He was always easiest to tell apart." They watched as the conversation abruptly ended. Howard gestured sharply, and both men began walking quickly toward the parking area, leaving behind confused staff at the tent. "Why were they leaving so fast?" Evie asked, panic creeping into her tone. "We should follow. I need to talk to that man." She started forward, but Walter grabbed her arm. "Evie, wait. We could be mistaken. If they really are our sons, Gabriel should be here too. Let's look around first. If he's nearby, we'll have all three. Then we call the police." Evie hesitated, torn. then nodded. "You're right, and we know where the farm is. We can find them again." They moved swiftly through the fairgrounds, eyes darting through the crowd, behind booths, under tents, everywhere. But no third man appeared. No one with Gabriel's features. No familiar glint of those intelligent, slightly mischievous eyes. "Maybe we're wrong," Walter said at last, though there was little conviction in his voice. But Evie was already moving again, heading back to Howard's tent. There, one lone staff member remained, packing away brochures and equipment into boxes. "Excuse me?" she said, trying to sound casual. "We were at the farm earlier and met Ferdinand. Then here at the fair we saw another man who looked just like him. Diego, I think? Are they brothers?" The man looked up, nodded. "Yes, they're twins." "Twins?" Evie repeated, exchanging a look with Walter. The man chuckled. "Actually, here's a fun fact. They're triplets. The third one isn't here today, though. He works at Mr. Howard's private estate, not far from the main farm." Both Evie and Walter froze, their mouths opened simultaneously. "Where is this private estate?" they asked in unison. The man blinked, visibly startled by the sudden intensity of their synchronized question. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping back slightly. "I can't disclose that. It's private property." He handed them a brochure. "Here's the farm address. You can always visit or write to us if you're curious about our programs." "Thank you," Walter said, accepting the pamphlet, even though they already had one. They stepped away from the tent, heading to a quiet corner of the fairgrounds, away from the crowd. "Walter," Evie whispered, her voice trembling. "Triplets." He said they're triplets, and they're the right age. "Ferdinand said Howard took him in when he was 6, Walter murmured, visibly shaken. "It's not a coincidence. It can't be." V clutched the brochure to her chest. The Cadillac in the photo, Howard's strange reaction, the secrecy, these 3 young men who look exactly like our sons. "For all these years," Walter said softly, "could we have finally found them?" Without another word, they rushed toward the parking lot, scanning the rows of vehicles, but Howard and Diego were gone. They jumped into their car. Walter gripped the steering wheel tightly. "We're going back to the farm," he said firmly. "That's where they'll go." Evie nodded and pulled out her phone. She dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Evie took a breath and said, "I'd like to speak to a detective. It's about a cold case, a missing persons case from 1981. My name is Evelyn Marlowe." The dispatcher remained calm and professional, taking down Evie's name, contact information, and a brief summary of the situation. The moment she mentioned the Marlowe triplets and their 1981 disappearance, the tone of the call shifted. The dispatcher promised that a detective would return her call within the hour. With the phone still trembling in her hand, Evie ended the call and looked over at Walter. "They're going to call us back soon, I think. I think this is really happening." Walter nodded, his jaw tight with tension. "Let's just stay calm until we know for sure. We don't want to scare them off, if they really are our sons." Evie's voice cracked. "They've been alive this whole time, and we never knew." Walter glanced at her as he drove. "What do we even say to them? If it's true, if Howard took them in and raised them, then they don't even know who we are. They might not even remember us." Evie looked out the window at the passing fields. "We'll figure that out later. First, we make sure they're safe. Then we find the truth." They reached the familiar gravel road leading to the farm. This time, it felt different, heavier. As they approached the wooden gate of Howard's Haven for Hope, the sun had already begun to lower, casting long shadows across the property. Walter parked the car a short distance from the entrance. "Let's wait here until the detective calls back," he said. "We shouldn't confront anyone until law enforcement is with us." Evie agreed reluctantly, Her foot tapped restlessly against the floor of the car. Every passing second felt like an eternity. Finally, her phone rang. She answered immediately. "Mrs. Marlowe, this is Detective Lynn Matthews with the Hidalgo County Sheriff's Office," the voice on the other end said. "You called about a cold case involving missing children?" "Yes, that's right," Evie said, breath catching. "My husband and I believe we've located our sons, triplets, who went missing in 1981. We think they've been living under different identities at a farm just outside town, run by a man named Howard Fielding." There was a pause. "I'm familiar with the Marlowe case," Matthews said. "We've kept the file active, hoping new evidence would surface. Where exactly are you now?" "We're at the farm. Howard's Haven for Hope." "I know the place," Matthews replied. "Stay put. Don't confront anyone. I'll send a team over immediately." As the call ended, Walter exhaled deeply. "They're sending someone." Phoebe closed her eyes for a moment, whispering, "Please let this be real. Let them be our boys." She was connected to Detective Martinez from the Missing Persons Unit. "This is going to sound incredible," Evie began, her voice trembling slightly. "But my husband and I believe we found our sons, our triplets, who disappeared 30 years ago." She recounted the photograph with the Cadillac parked in the background, the encounter with Howard Fielding at his rural charity farm, and the two men, Diego and Ferdinand, who looked identical to one another. She explained the discovery that they were actually triplets, the realization that a third brother worked at Howard's private estate, and the eerie familiarity of their features that matched her sons exactly. "They're the right age. They should be 36 now," she said, her voice breaking. "And they have the same hair, the same eyes, the same smiles. Howard Fielding was their elementary school teacher. He left the event in a hurry when we showed him the photo." "I understand your concerns, Mrs. Marlowe," Detective Martinez replied, his tone steady but urgent. "But I need you to promise not to confront Mr. Fielding on your own once you reach the farm. He was a respected figure in the community for decades, and we'd like to question him under the right protocols. We're gathering more information now and working on locating his private residence. My team and I are en route to the farm, and I've already contacted the local sheriff's department. They'll be on site in under 10 minutes. "We're almost there," Walter said, turning onto the gravel road leading to Howard's Haven for Hope. "If you see Howard, maintain a safe distance," the detective instructed. "The fact that he left the event with one of these men after speaking with you is concerning. We'll handle it from here, but proceed cautiously." "We will," Evie promised, still clutching the phone. They kept the line open as they pulled off the road, parking the car behind a grove of trees that allowed them to view the property without being seen. For several minutes, everything was still. The farm looked deserted, except for a single vehicle in the parking area. But then, figures emerged from the house. Evie tensed. "They're leaving," she whispered into the phone. "Howard, Ferdinand, and Diego. They're throwing bags into the trunk of Howard's car." "Stay where you are," Martinez instructed. "We found the property records. The farm is registered under an alias, not Howard Fielding's name. We're issuing search warrants for both the farm and his private estate now." Howard's car began to move, but before it could reach the main road, two sheriff's department vehicles appeared on the gravel path, lights flashing, cutting off their exit. Evie clutched Walter's arm. "The sheriff's deputies just arrived," she reported. "Good. Do not leave your vehicle until I give the go-ahead," Martinez said. Through the windshield, they watched as 4 deputies approached Howard's vehicle, hands resting near their belts. Howard stepped out slowly, raising his hands, his expression a carefully crafted mix of innocence and annoyance. Ferdinand and Diego followed, looking puzzled and anxious. One of the deputies engaged Howard in conversation. They could hear snippets on the wind. "Respected county service. Can't be misunderstanding." "I think the sheriff is hesitating," Walter murmured, his hand clenched into a fist. "Howard must have a solid reputation here." Eve's heart pounded. "They're gonna let him go," she said suddenly, panic rising in her chest. She dropped the phone into her purse but left the line open. Before Walter could stop her, she flung open the door and strode toward the group. "Howard Fielding," she called, her voice firm and clear. All heads turned. Howard's eyes narrowed as he recognized her. "Mrs. Marlowe," one deputy said, stepping toward her. "Please return to your vehicle. We're handling this." But Evie wasn't listening. She pulled the photograph from her purse and held it up high. "If you're even considering letting this man go, then look at this." She held the picture toward the group. "These are my sons, Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel Marlowe. They vanished 30 years ago, on June 12, 1981. She turned toward Ferdinand and Diego, her hand shaking. "Here are two of them, standing right in front of you." Ferdinand stared at the image, his face going slack. He stepped forward. "That's us," he whispered, "with Marco." "Is there a third brother?" a deputy asked sharply. Both men nodded, unable to take their eyes off the photo. "I did nothing wrong," Howard snapped, his voice rising. "I saved these boys. They were abandoned, left to fend for themselves." Evie's voice cracked with fury. "These were my children. They were never abandoned. They disappeared while playing outside our house." She jabbed her finger at the photo again. "That's your Cadillac in the background, isn't it? The same one you still keep hidden in the garage near the farmhouse." Diego looked between Howard and the Marlows, then spoke hesitantly. "Yes, he still has it. It's parked there now." Ferdinand turned to them, eyes wide. "Are you really our parents?" Howard sneered. "Don't listen to them. They were in prison. I saved you." Walter stepped forward. "That's a lie. We were never in prison. We never stopped looking for you. He's been lying to you for decades." "You've all grown so much," Evie whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Just like we always knew you would." "We're 36 now," Diego murmured, more to himself than anyone else, as if trying to anchor himself to the truth. "That's right," Evie confirmed, her voice steady. "You were born on February 15, 1975. The deputies looked at each other, and the lead officer stepped forward, voice calm but authoritative. "Mr. Fielding, turn around and place your hands behind your back. You are now under investigation for the unlawful abduction and concealment of minors and for providing false information to authorities." Howard's shoulders sagged as he complied, allowing the deputy to cuff his wrist behind his back. The murmurs around the scene grew louder, a blend of confusion, disbelief, and sympathy. Evie stood frozen, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. Ferdinand and Diego had backed away slightly, still gripping the photograph. A third deputy approached them, cautiously. "We'd like to ask you a few questions," he said gently. "Would you be willing to come with us to the station?" Both men nodded slowly, still in shock. "What about Marco?" Ferdinand asked. "He's still at the estate." "We'll send a team there," the deputy assured them. "You'll be reunited soon." Walter wrapped his arm around Evie's shoulders, holding her as she wept openly now, her body trembling. After 3 decades of pain and unanswered questions, the truth had finally started to come out. The boys, no, the men, standing in front of her were flesh and blood, not just memories trapped in fading photographs. A female deputy stepped forward, holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Marlowe, Mr. Marlowe, could you come with us as well? We'll need your statements, and the detective will want to speak with you both." Walter nodded. "Of course, anything you need." As they were escorted to the sheriff's vehicle, Ferdinand walked beside Evie, his face filled with 100 emotions. "You really never abandoned us." "Never," Evie whispered. We searched for you every single day. We never stopped." Diego chimed in, voice tentative. "Howard told us our parents were criminals, that we were better off starting fresh." "The man twisted everything," Walters said, trying to keep his voice calm. "We're going to make sure the truth is known now. All of it." The vehicles rolled away from the farm, the gravel road crunching beneath the tires. Behind them, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting golden light across the landscape. The truth was finally out in the open, but the journey ahead would be long. Yet for the first time in 30 years, it was one they wouldn't walk alone. Now officially named the primary suspect in the long-dormant kidnapping case, Howard Fielding stood handcuffed beside his Cadillac as deputies swarmed the property. One officer spoke urgently into his radio, confirming the execution of a warrant at Fielding's private residence. The once peaceful farm transformed in minutes into a hub of law enforcement activity. More vehicles arrived, lights flashing. Forensic teams began their methodical search through the buildings. Detectives split off, interviewing Ferdinand and Diego separately. In the garage, officers uncovered the Cadillac, the same cherry-red vehicle preserved in the photograph that had reignited the investigation. Its paint, though dulled by time, was unmistakable. In Howard's office, detectives found the original license plate hidden in a locked drawer, along with falsified documents bearing the names Ferdinand, Diego, and Marco. Identities carefully crafted to mask the truth, but Evie stood nearby, watching as evidence was carefully bagged and tagged. "They should be Lucas, Noah, and Gabrielle," she said quietly, pointing toward the paperwork. "I know Ferdinand is Lucas," she explained. "That wide, bright smile, it's unmistakable. Diego is Noah. He always had that thinner frame and those fast reflexes. Gabriel was the smallest, a little more reserved. That must be Marco. They're not even Mexican," Walter added, as he examined a forged birth certificate. "Our family background is mixed, sure, but we're primarily Anglo-European. It's just enough to make them pass as Hispanic, I guess." During questioning, Ferdinand shared more chilling details. Howard always kept Marco at the private house. He never let him come to the farm. Said it was too much work for him. Marco took care of the younger kids there, mostly orphans from immigrant families. "He told us we were rescued," Diego added. "He said our parents were immigrants who committed crimes and were sent to prison for life. We believed him. We were so young." "What did he do to you?" one of the detectives asked gently. Ferdinand and Diego exchanged looks. A silence settled between them, heavy with hesitation. "Nothing bad, not in the last 20 years, Ferdinand said finally. He expected total obedience, though. Everything had to be done his way. But our childhood was harsh," Diego added quietly. "He used to discipline us, made us strip down, touched us in ways that felt strange, then used a rattan stick when we disobeyed. We didn't know better. We thought we were bad kids, and that he had to do it for our own good. That's what he told us." Later that evening, just as twilight painted the farm in golden hues, a call came through on the sheriff's radio. It was from the unit executing the second warrant. "We found Marco," the officer reported. "He's safe, along with 8 other children ranging from 4 to 10 years old. We're transporting them to the hospital for evaluation. Most are frightened, possibly traumatized." Evie's hand flew to her mouth. "Marco, how is he?" "He's confused," the officer said gently, "but he's physically unharmed. We've explained the situation. He, Ferdinand, and Diego will all be reunited at the police station with you and your husband." As darkness settled, Evie and Walter were led to a waiting police cruiser. They glanced back at the farm one last time. This place that had been both a sanctuary and a prison for their children. They had found them. They had finally found their boys. "Our boys," Evie whispered, gripping Walter's hand as the cruiser began to roll down the gravel driveway. "We found our boys." At the station, Harsh fluorescent lights cast long shadows on the linoleum floors. Evie sat in a small, quiet interview room. A styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee sat untouched on the table before her. Detective Martinez sat opposite her, a recording device set between them. She recounted the last day of her boy's childhood with astonishing clarity. Her community was very close back then, she said, hands clasped tightly. Everyone knew everyone. Mr. Howard, he was the boy's favorite teacher. He was respected. He'd occasionally drive students home with the parents' permission. She described the details of that fateful day, her voice calm but pained. Walter and I were both home. We let the kids play outside. It was a safe neighborhood. This was 1981. The boys loved playing in the front yard. We didn't watch them every second. None of us did back then. You didn't see anyone take them? Detective Martinez asked softly. Evie shook her head. I was folding laundry in the back room. Walter was repairing a faucet in the backyard. One minute they were there, laughing, playing, and the next, they were gone. Martinez nodded, jotting notes into a file. We've interviewed Mr. Fielding and questioned his staff. Given his age and health, it seems he's chosen to cooperate rather than fight the charges. Evie sat straighter, eyes sharp. What did he say? Health claims he always felt a connection to the triplets. That's how he phrased it. That day, before he officially left town, he offered them ice cream. They loved that Cadillac, especially Lucas, right? Evie nodded, her voice faint. He was obsessed with cars. Fielding said he told them it was just a short drive. Martinez continued. He'd already packed essentials. He had forged documents. He drove them out of the county and eventually returned using a new identity. He paid for the property in cash and established a non-profit farm, supposedly for immigrant children. But Walter, who had been brought in to hear the findings, looked stunned. How was he never found? No witnesses, no red flags. It was a trusted figure, Martinez explained. To the children, it was just a treat from their teacher. There were no screams, no struggle. They went willingly. Evie murmured. They were known to wander the block, talking to neighbors. Exactly, Martinez said. The community didn't suspect anything. By the time a report was filed and a search began, he was already gone. He told them their home was gone, that their parents had been arrested. At that young age, confused and trusting, the boys believed him. Over time, he carefully crafted an alternate narrative of their past, one designed to isolate them emotionally from the outside world. Never let us ask questions, Diego had said during his interview. He told us we were safe with him and that the world was dangerous. He punished us when we asked too many questions about our past. Ferdinand had nodded in agreement. We grew up thinking the farm was our whole world. Why do you think he separated you from Gabrielle? Martinez had asked gently. I think he wanted to keep us under control, Ferdinand had replied. We were already too curious, too rebellious as we got older. Marco was the quiet one. He always listened. Maybe he thought it would be easier to mold him without our influence. The confession and matching evidence painted a grim but coherent picture. A trusted teacher had manipulated, abducted, and raised 3 boys under false pretenses for 3 decades. The trauma, both psychological and physical, ran deep. Yet amid the horror, there was now clarity. The fog of uncertainty that had haunted the Marlos for years was finally beginning to lift. As the interview concluded, Detective Martinez assured Evie that victim advocates and trauma specialists would begin working with the triplets immediately. DNA testing had been expedited and results would be ready within 24 hours. But everyone already knew what they would confirm. Outside the room, Walter was pacing in the corridor. When Evie emerged, he rushed to her side. They didn't need words. They simply held each other. In a nearby waiting room, Ferdinand, Diego, and Marco sat side by side. reunited for the first time in years. They were no longer Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel, only in name. They were reclaiming their identities, slowly, painfully, but together. He told them their home was unsafe, that their family was involved in something dangerous and unlawful. Bit by bit, day by day, he chipped away at their memories, replacing them with lies. Over time, his web of deceit grew so intricate that the boys, only 6 years old at the time, believed every word he said. The man they once called Mr. Howard, their trusted elementary teacher, became their new guardian, protector, and in their young minds, their savior. They trusted him. Detective Martinez explained, his tone heavy with a mix of pity and anger. He used that trust to manipulate them. At that age, children are incredibly vulnerable, especially when they're told their lives are in danger. Walter's grip on Evie's hand tightened, his jaw clenched. He said nothing, but his eyes spoke volumes: fury, grief, helplessness. The dragon's eye twitched with pain. He told them, the detective continued, that they were orphaned immigrant children, that their parents weren't who they claimed to be. According to him, you both had hidden their heritage, concealed their illegal status, and were ultimately arrested and sent to prison for life. He told them there was no home to go back to, and they believed it. Martinez leaned forward. He even created photo albums, fake ones, with doctored images and fabricated documents. He showed them photos of people they didn't know, people he claimed were their real family. It wasn't just lies, it was indoctrination, brainwashing, done slowly and meticulously. Evie sat motionless, her face ashen, her breath shallow. So the motive, it was just obsession? She asked, incredulous. Martinez nodded slowly. We've been investigating his background thoroughly. Fielding lost his wife and twin sons in a tragic house fire in the early 1970s. After that, it seems he suffered a psychological break. Although he functioned outwardly, kept his job, maintained relationships, internally he was unraveling. The trauma warped him. Based on both his confession and his psychological evaluations, it seems he started to believe certain children were meant to be his, especially children with close emotional bonds. Like triplets, Walter said quietly. The detective gave a solemn nod. Yes, to him it was fate. He didn't just kidnap your sons. He replaced the family he had lost with them. He built an entire life around that delusion. Evie closed her eyes. The weight of those lost decades, stolen by the delusion of a man they once trusted, threatened to crush her. She took a long, unsteady breath. What happens now? Walter asked, his voice brittle. Fielding will be facing numerous charges, Martinez said. Kidnapping, false imprisonment, identity fraud, child abuse, and obstruction. And more will likely follow. He'll be held without bail until trial. As for the other children found at his residence, we've already begun the process of identifying them and locating their biological families. Every one of them will receive medical and psychological evaluations. He stood, smoothing the front of his jacket. But I think there are 3 people who've waited long enough to see you. He stepped into the hallway and whispered something to an officer. A few seconds later, the door opened again. Ferdinand, Diego, Marco, Noah, Lucas, Noah, Gabrielle. They stood in the doorway, full-grown men, their faces hesitant but hopeful. And yet, to Evie, they were still her boys. Lucas, with his radiant, unmistakable smile. Noah, with eyes full of thought and quiet curiosity. Gabriel, smallest of the 3, still with the delicate features that once set him apart. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. The years, the void of 30 birthdays, of scraped knees, of school plays and family dinners, hung between them like an impenetrable fog. Then Evie stood. a sound like a sob catching in her throat. One step, then another. Her arms trembled, but she moved forward, drawn to them by a force greater than time. Walter stood beside her, his face streaked with tears. "My boys," Evie breathed, reaching out. "My beautiful boys." Lucas was the first to move. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and wrapped his arms around his mother. Noah and Gabrielle followed a heartbeat later. Walter stepped into the embrace. They were 5 again, one family together after a lifetime apart. They clung to each other, as if afraid that letting go would undo the miracle that had just unfolded. "I never stopped searching," Evie whispered. "Not a single day passed when I didn't wonder if you were still out there, still alive, still needing us." "We didn't know," Gabriel said, his voice cracking. "We thought you were gone forever." "But we're not," Walter said, his voice hoarse. "We're here, and we're together." Outside, the stars were blooming across the Texas night sky. Inside the police station, under harsh lights and sterile walls, a family once shattered began to knit itself back together. Slowly, tenderly, miraculously.